Okay, guys, good morning. Let's get started. So today we're going to scale up a bit. We're going to be thinking about the ecology of populations. So thinking about the ecology of groups of the same species. And so we're going to sort of gradually get bigger. We're going to start with populations, then we're going to go to ecosystems and communities, and then we're going to talk about much sort of larger topics for the remainder of the course, including, public health and epidemiology, and thinking, sort of broadly about climate change and the role of disease and stuff like that. So we're going to get much bigger as opposed to sort of where we started originally. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the group chat, or if you feel like blurting them out, you can also do that as well. And just as a final note, I also graded your weekly number 3. So if you have any questions on that, please let me know. So we're going to start with this quote that I really like. It's from Wilbur Zielinski. He's an author and a geographer. And Zielinski says, "The problem that shakes our confidence in the perpetuation and enrichment of civilized human existence, or even our biological survival, is that of growth, the rate, volume, and kinds of growth, and whether they can be controlled in intelligent, purposeful fashion." And I think this is a really apt quote for sort of modern day humans in terms of how we are growing and the way we are growing as a society, and how that is in sort of direct contrast to nature. And so we're going to talk, how populations naturally grow first, what are the sort of limits on natural population growth and things like that. And then we're going to switch gears at the end of the class and talk about this graph here on the right, looking at the human population, how we're going, what led to this sort of huge explosion of growth, where we're going in the future, and whether or not this is sustainable. And that idea of sustainability is something we'll come back and discuss a few more times throughout the class. But we're as the title of the class said, we're really starting to talk about ecology. And when we think about ecology, it's simply the study of organisms and how they interact with their environment. And their environment can be both the components of nature that are not living, which we would call the abiotic conditions, as well as the conditions that are biotic, which are the living conditions. And so we have this contrast between living and not living. And ecology is simply understanding how every organism fits into that capacity of living versus non-living. And we're thinking about ecology, there's multiple tiers to thinking about it. We like to think of sort of starting at the bottom, thinking about the individual level. And so that sort of forms the base of ecology. What is each individual doing at a given time? Then we step it up to populations, which are groups of the same species living together as one. And they don't have to be living together as one, like, say, a human population, like a family sort of thing, but it can just be a bunch of the same species living in, say, Boston Harbor. After a population, if we put a bunch of populations together, we have a community, which is, again, just a bunch of populations of different species of animals living together in the same area. And then finally, we scale up to the sort of the second largest level of ecology. And this is the ecosystem level. This is all the organisms, all the communities, potentially all the populations living together, and all the environmental conditions in that area. So if we were to look at Boston Harbor, we would say the temperature of the water, the salinity, all the things about the water, the tide, stuff like that, plus all the organisms living there. That's the ecosystem ecology that we think of, and that's what we're going to talk about next class. But we're going to start at the basics, individuals, populations first. I'll also just note that there is one sort of level that's higher than ecosystems, and this is really the sort of the planetary level. Everything is ultimately connected at the planetary level, whether or not we sort of can put those two and two things together. But there is a sort of a planetary ecosystem as well. And so, as I mentioned, the population ecology is studying the traits, behaviors, the actions of groups of the same organism. And now you'll see that traits has come up again. And as I mentioned, when we talked about evolution for the very first time, it is a central theme in biology. So it doesn't really matter what part of biology we've talked about. Evolution has sort of been a seed there, whether it's our organelles, whether it's ecology, whether it's microbes. Evolution has always been a thread, which is why we spent so much time going through evolution. But you notice that there is this trait idea. And if you remember back to our evolution class, when we're thinking about how evolution works, remember, evolution doesn't act on a single giraffe, right? Evolution acts upon the traits in a population of giraffes. So a population, remember, can evolve. So, and we are thinking about evolution, but we're also thinking about this idea of ecology and evolution together because they are linked together essentially at the hip. You can't have one without the other. In addition, we're throwing this new idea here that we talked about last class in behavior. How they behave together is also an important part of your ecology. And this behavior can be something as simple as running away from a predator, or as simple as just feeding or courtship, right? And that's sort of all the encompassing parts of ecology: the behavior, the traits, what they're doing, how they act as a group, how they act individually. That's what we're thinking about with population ecology here. When we're thinking about how a population is balanced, I think it's pretty intuitive to understand that a population is balanced by its birth and death rate, right? If you have more birth than death, your population grows in size. If you have less birth than death, your population decreases in size. I think that's pretty straightforward. Subtraction is pretty easy, right? So, oops, sorry about that. So population growth, again, is more offspring are being produced than are required to replace itself. And so remember, death is a natural part of life. I know it's sad, but nothing can, well, I'm not going to say nothing can live forever, because they recently resuscitated several million-year-old microbes. So maybe some things can live forever, but not everything that's typically speaking can live forever. So death is a natural process, and you have to replace things that die, whether it's because they were, what am I doing? Whether they were preyed upon, or whether or not they just got of old age and died, or they died of some disease. So you have to replace what has died if you want your population to either grow, or if you want it to even just continue to be the same size. And so typically speaking, the most basic type of population growth is what we call exponential growth. And exponential growth is when you start off sort of going a little bit slow, and you sort of hit an exponential curve. The idea is that you are essentially reproducing unchecked. You're essentially adding more and more every year. So it's like sort of the way a microbial population grows, as we talked about, right? 1 goes to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 6, and then so on and so forth. If you have this doubling every generation, that's exponential growth. And as you can see, within 30 years, we're adding, almost 100,000, or well, actually well over 100,000 individuals in a very short period of time. So it's really, really rapid growth. And so that's exponential growth. The other type of growth we typically and more commonly see in nature is what we call logistic growth. And it looks a little bit like exponential growth, but eventually this curve plateaus, it levels up, it reaches an asymptote, for those of you that like math. And you'll notice the asymptote of this curve is at what we call a carrying capacity. And a carrying capacity simply is how many of a given species can an ecosystem or an area, say a forest, can support with the amount of resources available. And now the resources we're thinking about here are sort of multifaceted, right? If you're going to have a large group of individuals, you need land, right? And you also need resources. You need food, you need water, right? So all those things sort of come together to essentially inform the carrying capacity. And the idea being is that depending on where you are on the planet, different ecosystems, different locations have different carrying capacities. So for instance, the forests in my backyard have a much higher carrying capacity than, say, the Sonoran Desert in the American Southwest, right? Just the amount of water, the amount of resources, the amount of area, well, maybe not my backyard area, but the resources in terms of food and water are much higher in my forest than they would be in the equivalent size plot of the desert, right? And so the carrying capacity of my forest is much higher than it would be for, say, the desert. But ultimately, if you are, so again, this is sort of the one of the two ways we can grow, either exponentially or logistically. Logistically, as you can see, is much more natural. Exponential growth, as you can see, it shoots over that carrying capacity. And I think you can imagine that once you overshoot a carrying capacity, that is not particularly good, because you're essentially going to run out of resources to support all these populations. And you'd imagine eventually this undergoing exponential growth would essentially tank. Right? They would essentially start to die off because there's just not enough resources at all. That being said, there's two types of two types of factors that limit population size, and these are density independent and density dependent factors. And so we're going to first talk about density dependent factors, and these are things that are simply related to how many individuals you have in a given area. And the idea of these density dependent factors are typically just dependent on the biology of these organisms. So when we talk about density dependent factors, these are things like food supply, habitat for living and breathing, parasitism as well as disease, and finally predation by something that's bigger than you or potentially by something that's in your own group. And so these are density dependent. And density dependent, again, is all based upon how dense of a population you have. Because you can imagine as you get denser and denser and denser, so adding more individuals in a confined space, food becomes a much bigger issue, right? If you have 100 wolves in a very small plot of forest, well, there's just simply not going to be enough animals there to feed those wolves. That's the same thing for anything, right? If you have 1,000,000 squirrels in your backyard, well, there's probably not enough seeds around to feed all those squirrels, right? And that factor, that density dependent factor, is going to limit how big the population can grow. And it's the same thing for all these other things. Parasitism and disease gets much stronger as you get more dense. And I think we've seen this pretty well with COVID. The places that have been hit the hardest with COVID, at least in the beginning, were very densely populated cities like Seattle and New York City, and even here in Boston to an extent. So very dense cities were hit the hardest by this disease of COVID because, again, it's easier for microbes to spread from one individual to another if you're living in very closely related spaces, I should say. Which is why I should also mention, and this is just sort of a note about COVID, is like this is why it's also important to social distance with COVID, because the closer you get to someone, the higher the probability is for that virus to sort of hop to you. And that's the same thing with COVID. That's the same thing with every sort of naturally transmissible disease that doesn't require sort of physical contact as well. In addition, predation is also much more likely if you're living very close together. It's easier for a wolf to grab one individual if you're all clumped together as a whole. So those are our density dependent factors. As I mentioned, there are two factors, and the second type is density independent. And these are factors that are simply not related to resources, but they're essentially just perturbations. And when we're thinking about perturbations in a natural sense, these are things like fires, storms, tornadoes, droughts, things like that, things that are just not biological in nature. Not thinking like pandemics or anything like that, but just anything that's not biological in nature. And so these can essentially change a population regardless of how big the population is. So if you have a forest fire, it doesn't matter if you have 5 squirrels or if you have 5 million squirrels. Well, a forest fire is going to do a hell of a lot of damage to your population of squirrels, regardless of how big your population is. Now, you might see more deaths in a very large population, but it's still going to affect both the same way. It had nothing to do with that sort of original density, which is why it's density independent. So that's population growth. And you can also just sort of look at how this looks over time. So we can pretend we have a population that's growing, and then we have some sort of it's in the bottom here, it's called a bad luck event. Some people call them divine interventions, depending on how you want to view it. But you could pretend we have a population growing and they get hit by, say, a hurricane, and it kills off a ton of the population. And then after a while, they reset and they come back and they get hit by another perturbation and their population declines, right? And that's the idea here with density independent factors. They don't matter how big you are. The population could have been down here. If you get hit with a hurricane, it's going to kill a lot of people, right? We know that from sort of, recent hurricanes, right? Look at Hurricane Maria, right? It killed a lot of people. So these sort of density independent factors are really good at sort of knocking back populations and controlling population growth. But again, no resources involved here. And humans ourselves are constrained as well. And we could also sort of think about how we might not be constrained by our populations might not be constrained, right? Because we have, the capacity to make tools, we have agriculture, we have the capacity to live in, in places where we shouldn't be able to live, like deserts, right? Or high on mountains, right? So humans are constrained, but we're sort of not constrained, right? And so you can ask the question, what sorts of technologies can mitigate our growth? And that's something I'd like you to think about before we get to the end of the class, because as I mentioned, the last part of the class will be talking about human population growth, but keep that in the back of your mind. Keep thinking what types of population growth would be what we see in humans, are we seeing in humans, and what types of technology can mitigate our growth, make it either good or bad. So as I mentioned, when we're thinking about factors, there's abiotic factors, which are not living, and biotic factors, which are living. So both of those two things come in essentially to limit population growth as well. But one of the sort of the most common types of population growth in these sort of dynamics of populations are what we call predator-prey dynamics. And these are essentially interactions between a predator and its prey. And so the idea being is, in the example we have here, and it's a pretty classic example, we have the lynx and the snowshoe hare. And as you can see, the lynx likes to eat the rabbit. And so you can see the population size here on the Y, and then we have some sort of arbitrary scale on the Y, the x-axis here. And we see the population of snowshoe hares go up and down and up and down. And these are going to be related to both predation by the lynx, but also related to just those density dependent factors, food, space, things like that. So you see that this population goes up and down and up and down, and you see the lynx population tracks with it, right? The lynx population gets bigger when there's a really good year of rabbits, and it goes in the toilet when there's a really bad year for rabbits. And you sort of see this predator-prey dynamics where one is increasing versus the other. And this can be driven by, again, this could be driven by predation. So, lots of hares, lots of lynxes, the lynxes drive it down. The more commonly we see that this sort of up and down of something like a hare is usually due to density dependent factors. That being said, there are some organisms that have this sort of relationship that are extraordinarily important to how ecosystems function. And these are what we call keystone species. And the lynx here is actually what we would consider a keystone species as well. But what we mean by this is organisms that have a disproportionately high effect on the ecosystem, meaning that if you removed it, it would dramatically change the dynamics of the ecosystem. So if you have a couple minutes, please take a peek at this YouTube video. It's about a classic example of a predator, of a keystone species called the otter, the California otter. And you can see how the California otter was instrumental at keeping the California coastline essentially in balance and in check and healthy. So once we removed it, you can sort of see how bad it was, because again, the California otter was a keystone species. So removing it had a disproportionate effect on how the ecosystem functions. Now, humans also might be considered a keystone species as well. We do have a disproportionately large effect on sort of our planet as a whole. And if you removed us from the planet would, it would probably do a lot. It would definitely do a lot better, but it would have a huge effect on the planet, right? If you think about what happened if you got rid of humans, how crazy nature would go. So that being said, humans do our own types of population management. And so we, as you all know, harvest natural resources. We harvest natural resources. So we take timber, we take animals, right? We take grasses, we take all sorts of things from the natural world. And so humans are sort of aware of this concept of what we call a maximum sustainable yield. And essentially is how much can you take from an area while that population will still grow the following year. And so this is most commonly referred to as quota limits in fishing, or quota limits on how much timber you can cut down. And this is why this idea of maximum sustainable yield is typically essentially it will allow you to, this population, if you harvested say a bunch of fish, for that population to still be able to reproduce and produce offspring for the next year, and essentially keep this population growing year after year after year. And so this is idea that maximum sustainable yield is somewhere along about halfway. It depends on the population. Some have much higher maximum sustainable yields than others, and some have much lower maximum sustainable yields, but it is lower than the carrying capacity. So you have to take less than the ecosystem can carry for the population to essentially keep going year after year after year. Now, if you take too much, you sort of remove this balance between birth and death. If you take too much, you're killing too much stuff. And if you don't have enough birth to sort of prop it up, the population would eventually die. It would essentially become overexploited, right? I'm sure you guys have all heard of this at some point in your life, of fishing industries being overexploited, people taking too much from things that are causing declines in the populations. And so there is this balance between overall between birth and death, but also how much humans take. Because again, we don't eat a ton of species, but there's only like a few hundred species of the thousands on this planet that humans eat. But as we sort of do things, we inadvertently sort of hit the populations of other things. So we have this sort of overall effect on this ratio between balance between birth and death by overexploiting that sort of the death part. And nature if it doesn't have enough people, it can't sort of prop up this birth, and it will essentially mess with the population balance if we take too much, if we over harvest something. which at one point is, kind of good, is why we have agriculture, right? We don't have to harvest the tons and tons of food from nature that we need. We can simply just grow it in a confined space. So there are bad things about agriculture too, but that's sort of one of the good things about agriculture. And so sort of the other side of this idea is making babies, right? So population of animals depends on how much they get. There's a number of different types of ways that organisms will make babies, and so one of the things we commonly see is what we call, it's sort of like a Big Bang reproduction. Organisms that reach sexual maturity at 1 year, they have a very intense period of short mating, and then the males die, preventing any further mating. So everything happens all at once. Huge amounts of investment in reproduction, and then there's no more reproduction until the next year. So really huge birth at once and nothing until the following year. So that's Big Bang reproduction. This is pretty common in some species of very small mammals, but not quite as common as the next type, which we call fast intensive reproduction, or what we call R-adapted species. And so these are what we see with most rodents. So the common house mouse is this type. Rabbits are similar to this. Basically anything you think that has very high populations sort of follows this, what we call this R-adapted or fast intensive reproduction. So these individuals reach sexual maturity very rapidly, sometimes as soon as a month. And they reproduce, and they essentially keep consistently reproducing every month. So, if a mouse gets pregnant after 1 month on the planet, it gives birth to babies, it raises them, and then a month later, after it's done raising the babies, it gets pregnant again and has more babies. So it repeats this cycle. So pretty intense mating consistently all year round. Next up is the slow and steady, which is you reach sexual maturity at 1 year and you have babies once a year. And typically the amount of babies you have is limited. So you're talking maybe, something like a mouse can have up to, 12 babies at once. Well, depends. It depends on the species of mouse, but some mice can have, 5 or 6 babies. Some mice can have 15 babies. It just depends. But usually when we're talking about this type of species, they produce a lot of babies at once, very much like this group. But our slow and steady ones, they produce a limited number of babies. So you're talking about like a litter, thinking about maybe like 4 or 5 individuals at once. So again, they reach sexual maturity at about a year. They have babies once a year. They're relatively small litters. And these sort of slow and steady individuals are a K-adapted species. This is where, sort of most of the larger mammals fall, reproducing once a year. So dogs, cats, typically would fall under this sort of thing, unless they're in sort of a more natural setting. Bats, as I have the example here, they do this. They have litters of little batlings once a year, and they reach maturity after 1 year. So that's the sort of the slow and steady. And then we have at a snail's pace, and there are some individuals that just take a really long time to reach sexual maturity. This is pretty common among the sort of the biggest individuals on the planet, and this is sort of true for humans. We're at the snail's pace in terms of how we make babies. This is the way elephants do things as well, but you reach sexual maturity later in your life, typically 5+ years after the fact. So humans don't reach sexual maturity until we hit puberty, which varies between 10 and some people don't. There's been cases of people not reaching puberty until they're 30, but that's not particularly common. So like say between 10 and 16, right? So it takes a long time to reach sexual maturity. And then you have babies every now and then, right? Humans can have a baby essentially once a year. There's some individuals that take several years to have a new baby. So for instance, like blue whales, or actually any species of whale, they'll have a calf and they'll raise that calf for years and years and years before having another one. And humans are very much the same, right? We have, sometimes one child, 1 year, and then we wait 5 years and have another one. It just sort of can vary, right? And humans can delay it for decades, right? So even if we reached our sexual maturity at 15, some of us don't have children until we're in our 30s. And so humans are we sort of buck the trend, but we do fit into this sort of snail's pace category as well. We are very, very slow relative to even, something that reproduces slow like a bat, and especially relative to something like a mouse. But you can imagine all of these life history strategies differently impact this ratio between birth and death, right? Those that reproduce a lot of children essentially inflate this number. But you can imagine if you're producing a lot of children, that means you're also probably going to die more frequently. Conversely, if you're going to produce very little children, well, it means you probably live longer. So depending on your life history strategy, depending on how you choose to have children, how often you choose to have children, it's going to affect what side of this is more overall. But if your population is going to grow, you have to have more people being born than are going to die. And so this leaves us to sort of this next topic of survivorship, and this is sort of directly related to how sort of often you reproduce, how fast you reproduce. And there are three what we call survivorship curves. And so we have the y-axis on this, just so we orient ourselves, is the proportion of individuals in a population surviving. This is not like how many live to adulthood or anything like this. Is like if I have adults, how many survive year after year after year. And then on the x-axis, which is age. So they're sort of, as you move right, it's older. As you move up, it's a greater proportion surviving. And as you can see, there are three types on here: type 1, type 2, type 3. And so type 1 is sort of best classified by the giant tortoise. And so once giant tortoises reach adulthood, they have a very high survivorship until very old age. And then once they reach a very, very old age, in the case of the tortoise, this is hundreds of years, but it's very old age, then they experience a rapid die-off at old age. So that's type 1. Very low death along the way, but very high death at very old ages. Type 2 is classified typically by birds, and birds, this are the sort of the classic way to think about type 2, is you have this sort of balanced death rate between how old you are and how young you are. It doesn't really matter how old you are or how young you are. You essentially, if you follow a type 2 curve, you essentially are equally likely to die at an old or young age. So, but it does, oops, I'm sorry about that. Population survivability does decrease as you get older. So, you're less likely to make it to old age than you are to young age, but you are essentially equally likely to die at any point if you fall sort of a type 2. And then finally is type 3. This is, mackerel, or the example given here, but this is pretty common for most of our selected species, things that have that very fast reproduction like mice. We have very high death rates early on and very few things surviving to late in life. So the idea being is you produce a lot of offspring early in your life and then you sort of die off. You get picked off by a predator or something like that. So these are 3 type curves. Humans typically fall into type 1, where we live, typically speaking, especially now in modern times when lots of babies aren't dying in childbirth and stuff like that. We're living to older ages, and then once we reach an older age, we essentially fall off the cliff in terms of death rate. So these are the 3 types of curves, and this is all influenced by how you spend your life. Things that are larger typically involve the type 1. Things that are very small, mice, mackerel are pretty small, fall in that type 3, and then sort of the in-between things sort of fall to type 2. But there is a lot of sort of back and forth here. You can imagine type 1 involves a much higher investment of energy and stuff like that, whereas type 3 is sort of not a lot of energy required to sort of get the individual. Right? Again, it's the case between a mouse and an elephant, right? A mouse follows this one, an elephant follows this one, and it's a lot more energy to power an elephant than it is to power a mouse. So, in addition, there's sort of, I'm going to stop touching my keyboard. There's these life history trade-offs that come with these survivorship curves, and they're all related to reproduction, as you can imagine, right? Because this is all about birth and death. And so there are essentially this life trade-off between how you live, how you grow, how you die, and how your population grows. And so when we're thinking about this, there's a trade-off between reproduction and survival for many species. So the classic example here is the salmon, but this is very true for many fish like the salmon, like alewife or steelhead trout, stuff like that. Things that once they reproduce, the adults then go on and die. So there's no adult individuals of salmon after they reproduce. They essentially make this huge investment by laying millions of eggs for the next generation, but the adults eventually die off. So you can imagine the salmon population goes from really high numbers to essentially 0, and then once all the eggs hatch, they're back up to really high numbers. Next up is this trade-off between reproduction and growth. as we sort of talked about, making gametes involves an investment, right? We're thinking about, animals, right? Making an egg is a pretty substantial investment. But if you're making seed and if you're making fruits, right, that's a pretty intensive, sort of energy intensive thing. So there's this trade-off between how often you reproduce or the intensity of reproduction and how much you're going to grow. So the good example of this is trees. In this case, we have a beech tree. And they only reproduce every couple years or so. And so they spend most of their lives growing, essentially increasing the size of their tree trunk, growing taller. And every couple of years, they essentially forego growth, invest in reproductive cells. So essentially they can reproduce, because there's a trade-off between how much energy you can use to grow and how much energy you can use to physically produce gain. Essentially can change how much, essentially will modify how many eggs or how many individuals they produce based upon as well as the investment they make in those eggs or individuals based upon the resources available. So, and there are also so there's another sort of last component about all this in terms of how you do this is the environment, right? Natural selection is what determines the sort of the heritability of traits, but ultimately the resources present, those density dependent factors, sort of limit all these things, right? A rabbit can't essentially produce high numbers of offspring and expect them to survive if the conditions are really bad, right? You can imagine if this was all covered in snow, right? Well, it would be really bad if these rabbits mated, right? And produced lots of offspring because, well, if it's covered in snow, there's not a lot of food, right? Especially for the older rabbits, but definitely not for the younger rabbits. Now, when things are not snowy, it's a good time to reproduce. So there is this life history trade-off between when you can reproduce and what the environment itself is physically giving you. And one last thing I'd like to sort of chat about is this idea of age. And there is this relationship between how old you are and disease as well. And one of the sort of important things about age, outside of just getting a viral or bacterial infection, is this idea of genetic disorders. And so we sort of talked about this idea. As you get older, as you age, your body starts to sort of break down, right? And that's sort of natural death, right? But there is this idea of genetic diseases, as we discussed in class earlier this week. So there are a number of diseases out there that can essentially prevent you from reaching sexual maturity and prevent you from having offspring. So we talked about a number of these ones. We could think of something like cystic fibrosis. It has some sort of mutant allele. It causes early death of this infant, and they essentially don't live on to reproduce. That's in contrast to something, say, like Huntington alleles, but Huntington disease, right? You have an allele that's essentially a defective one. You reach sexual maturity and then you reproduce, passing that allele on to the next generation, and then the individual themselves goes over and die. And so genetic diseases, they can sort of act in one of two ways. One, to sort of limit early population growth, as we see with something like cystic fibrosis here, or something like Huntington's disease, which limits population growth of older individuals and essentially keeping that in check for the following generation. One of the sort of things about humans is we've sort of thrown this balance out of whack. In nature, genetic diseases will get rid of and will be a great selecting force for death in the population. Humans can keep individuals alive even if they have some pretty deleterious genetic disorders as well. So, another important factor with population growth, and again, this life history strategy is, oops, sorry, I gotta stop hitting my keyboard, is this idea of risk. And so we have this sort of concept of risk, and it's pretty, it's not like the board game, but you can think about, like, if you're going to cross the street, it's safer to cross the street. It's less risky to cross the street when there are no cars versus when traffic is booming, right? So there's this idea of risk, and this is something that is natural as well. The idea being is some organisms live a much more risky lifestyle. And so some individuals, like an owl, you can imagine an owl is flying through the air and it's capturing rodents. It has a much more risky lifestyle, right? It's much more risky for an owl to hunt right? Because it could potentially crash and kill itself, or crash and break a bone. And if it crashes and breaks a bone, well, that could be a death sentence for that owl. That's in contrast to our lovely tortoise here, which looks like it's taking a selfie, I always thought, but which has a very low risk. Essentially, it hunts for whatever on the ground. It doesn't fly. It's very low risk. So the risk difference between how these two individuals feed is very different, and that leads to different lifespans too, right? Things that have high risk in terms of behavior essentially will live less long, and those with a very low risk will live much longer. But in addition to that, we have this concept of what we call predation pressure. And predation pressure essentially is how likely you are to be eaten. So the example in this figure, I use this figure to talk about sort of two different types of risk, one being how you feed, and the other one being how you are fed upon. And so rodents have a very high predation pressure. They're very small. They're food for lots of things, food for birds, they're foods for, cats, they're foods for snakes, things like that. So lots of things like to eat rodents. And they have a very high predation pressure, which again is just the probability that you will essentially be eaten. And so they have a very high predation pressure, and that leaves them to have a very low lifespan. Most rodents don't live beyond a year. It's very rare to see a rodent live beyond 2 years, just simply because it's more likely to be eaten by something like an owl. That's in contrast to our selfie-taking tortoise down here, which has essentially no predation pressure in their natural environment. Most tortoises don't have anything that will feed upon them. And so they can grow to be very old age because they don't have to worry about being eaten. So that's risk. Risk is an important factor. And it's related all to this concept of life strategy. And so these are population growth things, and these are density dependent factors. And so we sort of talked about, how all these different factors can limit population growth. But the question, excuse me, the question I sort of posed to you earlier in the class is, how does human, excuse me again, I'm sorry about that. How does human population growth relate to all these things? And these are all, again, density dependent factors because they're all related to, how dense the population is. So we want to sort of answer this question is, how do humans relate to all these things? And one of the sort of interesting things I wanted to sort of talk about humans is this idea of, before we sort of get into the rest of stuff, is one of the things that doesn't really affect us as much is this concept of predation. And there's very few things that prey upon humans in the conventional sense, right? There's no, bigger predator. Oops, sorry about that. I got to stop touching my keyboard. There's nothing big that preys upon humans, right? There's no like giant tiger that just hunts down humans, right? Not in a meaningful way, right? There's occasions where animals kill humans, but there's no like predator of humans in the traditional sense, right? Right, not like a wolf eating a deer, right? That's sort of standard predator prey thing. That's not really a thing for humans. Now, you could argue that disease is our predator. Viruses prey upon us, bacteria prey upon us. You could also argue that mosquitoes prey upon us, right? Mosquitoes cause the death of hundreds of millions of people every year through the diseases they carry. So you could argue that. But in the traditional sense, predation is not really a thing for humans. But the rest of these certainly are. So where do we currently stand? We're at about actually, I forgot to change the number on this. The most recent count is about 7.65 billion people on this planet. That is true, Bree. We do prey upon each other. That is a good thing. That is a good thing to mention. Not that killing people is a good thing, but it's a good thing to mention. That's what I meant by that. Yes, we do prey upon each other, but murders of humans, direct murders, isn't that high. Maybe it's not even a top 10 cause of death in the United States. But you could also make the argument that the way we approach our economy, right? Profit margins being everything, right? Not supporting people that are sick or hungry is a type of predation. And so you could argue, or maybe something like pollution or even climate change going forward, right? You could argue that's a form of predation, which does kill millions upon millions of people every year. So in one sense, in the traditional sense, we don't, humans killing other humans directly isn't a big form of predation, but indirectly, we're really good at killing each other. So just as a note, that's a really good point. So in terms of where we stand, again, we're at 7.65 billion people. We add about 85 million people every year. And as you saw from that sort of first slide, we're still growing as a population, right? We're still growing, which means there are far less than 85 million people dying every year. And it depends on the year. So this will be a much heavier year in terms of deaths because of COVID, but there's still, 20, 30, 40, 50 million people dying every year, depending on the year. So, but clearly we are adding that ratio of birth and death is not in favor of humans, where more people are being born than are dying. If our current trajectory continues, we anticipate that 9.7 billion people will be on the planet by 2050. There are other estimates that put the population growth at 12 billion. There's others that suggest that the population might decline back to 6 billion. Our best guess right now is by 2050, about 9.7 billion people. And the vast majority of growth at this point in time occurs in low and middle income countries. So the places we're seeing the greatest population expansions are in places like Africa. We're seeing huge population expansions in Southeast Asia, still seeing huge growth in India as well. And we're not seeing very much growth in countries like the United States, Europe, Australia. China is slowing down. We don't see a lot of growth in Russia as well. So most of the sort of what you would call, established countries are not growing quite as fast as the sort of the lesser established countries. And sort of one other one way to think about how human population grows is the first way would be globally, right? So I gave you that 7.6 billion people. And that is simply a balance between birth and death, right? The global population grows by having more people being born than dying, and it decreases by having more people die than born. Oh, one last thing I want to mention about this 9.7 billion people. We actually think that we might not hit that because of the rising inequality of wealth on the planet as a whole. Less people are having children. So we think that actually we probably aren't going to reach 9.7 just because of the way sort of capitalism is sort of pushing the sort of economic inequality to sort of make it less fair for people that just sort of don't do as well economically. But again, global population, again, balance between that birth and death. Now, but when we're thinking about a countrywide, it is a balance between birth and death still. But in the case of the United States, where our birth rate is not that much higher than our death rate, or something like Germany, which has almost an identical birth and death rate, this concept of immigration and emigration is really, really important. Countries like the United States, countries in Europe, Russia, things like that, this birth rate is low. And that's pretty true in most sort of well-established countries that have sort of what you call sort of a more advanced economy, I guess. Population growth is not huge. A lot of people aren't being born. What really props up the United States and, again, more developed countries like you would see in Europe is this balance between immigration and immigration. And so how many people are coming in for immigration and how many people are leaving the country? And what really drives the population of the United States up year after year is actually immigration. Immigration sort of keeps our population growing year after year simply because our birth rate is not that high. And it's not that high because, typically speaking, as you do well off more and more, you have less children. But also because if you can't move up economically speaking, right? You probably don't want to have more children. But what props up more advanced countries, as I mentioned, is this idea of immigration. And this is what sort of buoys up the population in the United States. We keep growing year after year after year, not as fast as some other countries, but we still keep growing because what really drives us up is actually immigration from other countries, in Europe, especially in Central and South America. So what keeps our populations growing and what changes our demographics as well is sort of this immigration. Immigration is not that high in a country like the United States. Usually once people get here, they sort of stay here. But again, what is driving sort of population growth in most countries, again, like the United States, Europe, Australia, things like that, is this immigration, people coming from countries that are booming in population. And this relates to this concept of population density. And I'm sure you guys have probably heard of this concept before, but a population density is simply the number of individuals of a given species per unit area or per unit volume if you're thinking about the ocean. So the idea being is you can have a very high population density like Manhattan or here in New York City because you have a lot of people living in a very small area. right? And so we can look at the population density of the United States, and you can see there are some places that have, and the idea, this is topographical, meaning the higher the peak, the more population there is in a smaller area. And so you can see that the United States has lots of peaks, right? Every state has one peak. Some states have multiple. Right? Because as you'll notice that the vast majority of human populations are concentrated in urban areas. And that's pretty much true across the planet. If you look at population density, no matter where, do I have the good graph? Yes, I do. So if you look at global population densities across the planet, it's pretty heavily concentrated in big cities. So the statistic is somewhere around 65% of all people live in cities. It depends what country you are. It's a little less in the United States. It's about 50-50, 50 rural, 50 city living. But you'll notice is that population density is really high in the city. The other thing you'll notice is that population density gets extraordinarily high by the coast. And this is a sort of a two-part historical legacy. Living near the coast was important because the coast brings, as we talked about, climatic stability. So remember, water absorbs a lot of energy, so it keeps the climate more stable, keeps it cooler. In addition, it also provides access to a really valuable resources, which is the ocean. Right? The ocean is bountiful, right? But sort of in modern times as well, thinking about, like industrial revolution onwards, it's access to shipping, right? By able to be access to shipping means you can get goods, send out goods, mean your economy can be bigger. So it's not a mistake that most of the population is by the coast. And again, as I mentioned, about 50 to 65% of the population lives in cities. Of those cities, of all those people sort of living, about 50% of people live within about 100 kilometers of the ocean. So the ocean is a really, really big deal. And then you also, just one other note is you also notice that population densities get really high around big lakes. So you can see Lake Victoria in Africa here. And you can see our Great Lakes here, right? Chicago has, 3.5 million people. Detroit has, close to 1 million people or so, right? And so you see population density also gets really high around big lakes because, again, it's basically like small oceans, right? It's good for shipping, good for getting resources. So, but you'll notice that the reddest areas of this planet are in Southeast Asia, and this is where population is the highest, right? Between China and India alone, they account for like 2.8 billion people on this planet, which is at our current 7.6 billion is about 1/3 of our population. So just in these two countries, that is the highest amount of people. And as you'll notice, they're essentially on fire, meaning their population density is also very, very, very high. But this population density also leads to varying levels of age structure. And you can look at the sort of a couple different types of populations. So we have an expanding human population, a stable human population, or a declining human population. And what you're seeing is this is the number and proportion of people at each age in a given population. So we have pre-reproductive, 0 to 14, reproductive, 15 to 44, and post-reproductive, 45 and older. And you'll see that populations that are expanding have a very high population of pre-reproductive, meaning there's lots of babies being born. There's also going to be lots of people heading into those reproductive years, meaning that the population will continue to grow. We have what's called a stable population, where the amount of children is essentially in balance to the amount of reproductive adults there are, meaning that the population will continue to grow, but it's not going to be expanding like we're seeing here. And then finally, we see a declining population where there's less children in this pre-reproductive age relative to the sort of the older categories here. And one of the things you should sort of make note is that it depends on what type of country you're in, is how big this sort of post-reproductive population, how old. You notice that as we sort of go from expanding to stable to declining, the amount of old people increases. And these are also typically related to sort of economic statuses, right? As I mentioned, most countries that aren't doing well economically are expanding very rapidly. Most countries that are sort of stable or declining are doing well off more economically, and they have much larger, older population. For instance, the United States, the formerly largest population in the United States as an age group was baby boomers. That was been since replaced by both millennials and whatever the group after, Gen Z. So, and then we can look at sort of this very specific demographics of other countries. We have Nigeria, rapid population growth, United States, very slow population growth, and then Germany, population decline. And we can see that very similar sort of three graphs as we saw from the previous slide. But you can also notice that, again, expanding population, very few old people, and then sort of more established populations, many, many more old people. So as a human population, sort of just look at how we've changed over time. So this is, 5 million years ago, that's, when we started essentially, as we sort of talked about in the human evolution aspect. And you just notice is that we sort of just it looks kind of like a flat line. The population was growing through this time point. Don't think because it's a flat line, it's not growing. It simply looks like a flat line because the population growth here is so fast. But what you'll notice is that about 4000 BC, and it depends on who you ask. Most people say agriculture sort of arose at about 8,000. Some people say 10,000, but 8,000 is a pretty good estimation. Once agriculture sort of took a foothold, if this was sort of zoomed in, you start to see the population expanding faster. And then you're starting to sort of see, 2000 BC. So this is BC. So yeah, 8,000 would be 10,000. I always look at these wrong, I'm sorry. And you start to see 2000 BC. By the time we hit 0 BC, population sort of comes above the line. And we sort of just kind of, are growing a bit. We have some pretty substantial declines along the way due to various diseases, in particular the Black Death. That was one of the sort of the big things. But you notice is that by the time we hit 1800, we're at 1 billion people. 1930, 2 billion. 1960, 3 billion. And by the time we're at 2011, we're at 7 billion. So you can see that within 100 years, 111 years, we've expanded our population by 7 times. That 7-time expansion is more than we expanded it in thousands of years. And you can see we just have this really rapid population growth, right? And we have this continued rapid population expansion. And you can imagine that there's some overall carrying capacity to the planet, right? Is there a limit to how much humans can be on this planet? And the question we can ask is, how long can the human population keep growing? Can we keep growing? What limits the human population growth? So the agricultural revolution, so the advent of growing crops and livestock, allowed us to feed more people, right? You can grow more food per acre of cropland than you could grow in a forest, right? That's just the way agriculture works, right? And you can have more cows in a pasture than you can have naturally in the wild, right? So it allows you to grow more food in a smaller area, which essentially led to, the agricultural revolution, allowing us to feed more people. So that was step 1, being able to feed people. Step 2 was the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s, and that allowed us to essentially access to more mechanical labor, which allowed us to farm better, which allowed us to build things faster, allows access to a lot of different things, as well as medicine. Sort of coinciding with the Industrial Revolution was the sort of expansion of sort of what we would call modern medicine. And all those things act to keep humans alive. After the Industrial Revolution, technology expanded, right? We invented, ways to communicate long distance, electricity. We invented cars, right? We switched away from manual labor, engineering feats, right? We can make huge buildings, which means thousands of people can live in one spot, right? And then ultimately, one of the sort of important things is the death rate dropped. And so as we talked about in the microbial slide, the microbial class, better sanitation in healthcare means less people die from infectious diseases. So all these things really contribute to our population growth. And one just sort of final note, I want to just sort of go back to this graph here before we sort of move on. One final note. Trade, because back in the 1930s, where population was at about 2 billion, we invented a process called the Haber-Bosch process. And this allowed us to industrially make fertilizer. And as I'm sure you all know, when you add fertilizer to food, it grows better, right? You can produce more food, it grows faster. And so the invention of fertilizer in the 1930s, as opposed to relying on natural sources of nitrogen and phosphorus and stuff like that, you can see led to an extremely rapidly expanding population, right? Between 1800 and 1930, so 30 years, we added 1 billion. But after this process, the next 30 years, we added 1 billion. And then 15 years later, we added 1 billion. And then 13 years later, we had 1 billion. And because of sort of rapid expanses in how we use fertilizer, it allowed our population just to take off more and more because we can grow more food and thus feed more people. Food also gets cheaper when you grow a lot of it too, right? So that's another sort of major milestone along the way is the advent of fertilizer. I know that might not seem like a sort of a big deal, but it really, really was. But as that sort of previous graph showed, the population is still growing. And so our growth rate as a human population on the planet has slowed since the 60s. So we're not growing as fast as, this, aspect we're seeing here, but we are still growing at about 1.2% a year. In terms of how the population is growing, 96% of those 85 million people that are born every year are in less developed countries. So you think about Africa and parts of Southeast Asia. And then essentially the idea being is the population growth, this leads to the population growth in these less developed countries being 14 times higher than it is in, say, a country like the United States. So it does drive, the way we are growing and where we're growing is very, very different. So, this sort of, huge expansion of population is not like everything is growing uniformly. It's certain places are growing much, much faster. And as I mentioned, we are moving much more from rural environments to urban environments as well. And so the question we need to ask is how the heck long can we keep growing? So we talked about density dependent factors, right? Things about age and disease and resources, right? How long can this planet, which at this given point in time, maybe not in 50 years, but at this given point in time, we only have one planet. So we only have a limited number of space. We only have a limited number of space for growing food, and we have a limited number of resources on this planet. So how long can we keep growing? And this ultimately relates to how well we treat the planet. We're going to talk about this a lot next week, but how you treat the planet will dictate how much you can grow as a population. And so sort of the way we sort of treat things normally is exploit, exploit, exploit. Take as much as we can. It's the best for profits. But that doesn't really coincide with limitless population growth of humans. Because as you take more and more and more, as you overshoot the carrying capacity or you overshoot the sustainable yield, you start to damage natural populations, damage natural resources. And so what this leads to, as we keep taking more and more, as our population keeps growing and growing, as we start taking things from the planet less and less sustainably, this leads to what we call ecological tipping points. And we'll talk about this concept of a tipping point when we talk about climate change because they are related. And I'll also mention climate change is also going to play a factor in how much the human population can keep growing. But we'll talk about that when we talk about climate change. But this idea of a tipping point is if we essentially push nature too far, it essentially won't rebound. And so the idea being, if you push it beyond a tipping point, it might be long-term changes, right? Long-term changes to disease, right? Long-term changes to your resources. If you rely on fish, right, and you keep pushing and pushing and pushing on the fish population, well, you might push past the tipping point, kill off the fish population in a meaningful way, meaning that you can't sustain your population anymore because you don't have enough fish that you depended on. And so that's what we mean by tipping point. It doesn't come back. But you can also think of a tipping point as maybe we get so dense that disease becomes too much to handle. And COVID is I think a good example, but it's also sort of a bad example for this, right? COVID is a pretty good check on the population from what we know. It spreads really rapidly. Its death rate isn't as high as some of the really bad plagues throughout history, but it does serve as a good reminder that disease can be really bad and really strong pressure on population. If COVID was, say, worse, say COVID was as terrible as, say, something like smallpox is with a 30% death rate, COVID would be a huge pressure on our population. And that's something that as we get bigger and bigger, diseases become much, much more of a problem. So there is this sort of tipping point. Do we reach a tipping point in our population where it's just no longer sustainable because we're over harvesting, because we're taking too much from nature, or because we're just simply too big that disease pressure becomes too much? And when we sort of think about this as in a scientific way, when people analyze this problem, there's a lot of issues here, right? There's lots of large and quickly growing populations in developing countries, and that's the problem, right? The more and more people you add, the faster you add it, the more resources you have, the more you have to take from nature. But every population at some point that's large had to do that. That's sort of a natural way humans grow. But that's in direct contrast to overconsumption by countries like us, countries like China, countries in Europe, right? In much more developed and affluent countries. The United States as a whole, we are extremely, sort of taxing on nature. We have, our impact on nature is, 10 to 100 times higher than most other countries. And that's the same for China. That's the same for in Europe as well. So more developed countries put a greater pressure on these resources and ecosystems and are more likely to push things towards tipping points. And so those more developed countries and developing countries do put pressure on these ecological tipping points. But one thing that does sort of help us is our technology. We have developed all sorts of technology that are allowing us either take more resources or pull resources out in a more safer fashion. But technology might allow us to overcome some of these tipping points. But as of now, technology is not helping us enough to not push nature towards this sort of over-harvested, towards some more of a tipping point as well. So, and the way we could think about sort of keeping this balance, right, of growing but not overtaking is potentially slowing population growth, or potentially reducing resource use, or potentially both, right? Some way to sort of keep the population in check. And now when we're thinking about how humans can grow, there's sort of a couple of different sort of ways we think about this. We all need places to live, right? We need land of some sort, whether you live in a building or you live in a house, right? You need some sort of land. And so that's one way we sort of can do, right? We can expand into new areas, but there is a limited amount of land on this planet, right? So there's only so much land we can colonize, and there's only so much land that is good for living, right? We can't live in the middle of the Sahara Desert, right? We can't live in the middle of the Antarctic Circle, right? Or the Arctic Circle, right? We can only live in certain places. So there's only so much places we can expand. We can increase the amount of agriculture and productivity of the land. Fertilizers are a great way to increase productivity, but they can only do so much. And then we can only grow so much food in a given place. But more importantly, the way we fertilize is damaging to soils. So the way we fertilize isn't particularly valuable for long-term growth in terms of production of food, but it is good for sort of right now. But also some land is just not available for food production, right? You can't grow food in a desert. You can't grow food in the middle of a forest, right? You can't grow food in certain places because it's just not right. And then finally, we could potentially find ways to live at higher densities. Maybe we get around this idea of expanding into new areas, but just simply grow denser. But remember, as we grow and become much, much more dense, the more likely we are to suffer from something like disease. But again, we are still this balance between the natural world, between growth and death, birth and death. And what really will limit us is our sort of capacity to sort of overcome sort of all these factors that we've been talking about, all these things that act to, the way what's really going to limit the human population is not so much what Earth can provide, it's how we take from the planet, right? We have one planet. There's no other planet that has the things we need. There's other planets that have water, but, water right now isn't the biggest thing. It is in some places, but globally speaking, it's not the biggest problem. But how we handle nature, how we handle taking things is really going to determine how much we grow, whether we hit that 9 billion, whether we don't hit that 9 billion, whether we hit 12 billion. And it ultimately depends in terms of humans is how we take things from nature as a whole. So that's my little shtick on human population growth, and that's going to take us to the end of the class. I hope this sort of track down human population growth was interesting. I think it's a nice sort of gateway into what we're going to talk about next class. Next week, I should say, when we're thinking about, ecosystems, when we're thinking about other sort of larger topics about how the globe itself functions and how humans sort of fit into this. Because I hope I've convinced you that humans are pretty taxing on the planet. And I think that's something that we all sort of know. We can see how dramatically humans change the environment, but how that fits into the sort of natural order is sort of an important thing to think about. How you fit in with nature is important, because as much as we like to think we aren't sort of subjected to nature, we really are. So with that, that's going to be the end of the class. If you guys have any questions, as always, please let me know. If you have not sent me the topic for your paper, the article you're going to write about, please do so, because it is due next week. So I believe it's next Thursday, if I'm not mistaken. So please send me that. And if you have any questions while you're writing, or any issues while you're writing, or you're having trouble, please let me know. I will just make mention, don't try to like artificially inflate your paper, because you feel like you have to write more. Write what you need to write. There's a low page limit for the reason, because I want you to write succinctly, and I want you to write a good sort of narrative through these things. I don't care how much you write. I just want you to write a good sort of analysis of what you're talking about. So with that being said, if you do have any questions, please do let me know. Otherwise, I hope you guys all have a great weekend.